In 2020 in London, they assembled 300 soldiers, each with a lifespan of just 10 to 20 days. They were supposed to get from London all the way here to a remote Atlantic island, where bizarre insects had multiplied so fast they were starting to wipe out the entire place. Those soldiers were tiny parasitic wasps, Microteres neatneri. You can't just toss them in checked luggage. The only way to get them there alive was to slow their metabolism with cold. So the wasps were chilled and packed into refrigerated shipping containers for deployment. One temperature slip, and it was over. The whole gamble centered on one target, a small forest right in the middle of the island. The only forest on the entire territory. That's exactly where the release began. In April 2021, the first wave of soldiers was released on Nightingale, but there was a nasty catch. After the journey, only about 10% of the original 300 were left. And this wasn't an army, it was a recon team. With numbers like that, they couldn't defeat anyone. The goal was simply to hold ground on the island. Because if you're up against tens of thousands of enemies, 10% of a tiny force won't change a thing. They'd barely be noticed. The only real chance was to create a spawn point on the island, a place where the wasps could reproduce and rebuild their ranks without any further help from humans. That's when the real mission began: start producing new soldiers on site. The photo shows the pivotal moment of the entire operation. A wasp lands right on a scale insect and lays her eggs inside it. That's why the wasps were hauled so far, to wipe out the scale insects. And the plan worked. The population took hold and then scaling began. In a year and a half, that handful of survivors turned into thousands of soldiers. And once the army was big enough, the campaign for the main prize of this war began. Filica arborea are the trees the scale insect nearly wiped out, and they're exactly why these wasp soldiers were brought to the island in the first place. Invasive scale insects that sucked sap from plants arrived on Nightingale by accident, carried in with people and cargo. After that, everything followed the worst-case script. The insects took hold and began spreading rapidly across the island, moving from one tree to the next. How did they spread so quickly? Because the conditions were perfect. Across the entire island, there were no natural predators to keep the scales in check, so their population simply exploded. And when there are enough of them, they excrete a sticky substance on leaves and stems which resembles honeydew. Then sooty mold grows on top of it. On plants, it looks as if everything has been smeared with soot. But it's not just grime. Sooty mold blocks photosynthesis, meaning the tree can't function normally, and in the end, the harm from that coating can be even worse than the insect's direct damage. Though that's not exactly pleasant either, especially up close. A scale infestation can look like stems have been covered in living dots. The insects are packed together in a dense layer. So a tiny, almost invisible insect suddenly became a threat to an entire forest. And with that forest, to a small population of birds that depends on those trees. This forest is the only place on Earth where the tiny Wilkins bunting lives. You won't find it anywhere else in the world, nowhere at all. So if the forest goes, the bird doesn't even have a plan B. And this isn't just some endangered bird. On the Tristan da Cunha Islands, nature works like a standalone evolution lab. Kind of like Darwin's Galapagos. In both places, you get truly independent, one-of-a-kind species with their own quirks. Wilkins bunting has evolved a very specific niche. It feeds on the fruit of a single native tree, Filica arborea, the same tree that's being heavily attacked by scale insects and that has basically no defense against them. So the trees started collapsing fast. During a 2018 visit, scientists recorded a sharp increase in sick trees. In monitored plots, the share of infected trees rose from about 29% in 2011 to 85 to 100%. In other words, within just a few years, most of the forest was hit, and it was never very large to begin with. It seemed like things couldn't possibly get worse, but then the island took another hit. In 2019, two powerful storms struck in quick succession. And this wasn't the kind of weather you can simply wait out at home with a cup of tea. Thankfully, there were no human casualties, but the storms were so intense that they severely damaged homes and knocked out communications across the island. They were described as the most destructive natural disaster since the volcanic eruption in 1961. The hardest hit were schools and government buildings, along with the fishing plant, the backbone of the island's economy. While people were restoring communications, repairing houses, and trying to grasp the scale of the damage, another tragedy was unfolding in the island's wild, uninhabited areas quietly, without sirens. The trees had already been weakened by insects, and the heavy winds finished them all. The scale insect set it in motion, and the weather finished the job. About 80% of the island's forests were affected, and when the forest collapsed, so did the food supply. Birds suddenly had almost nothing to eat. The buntings flew around searching for fruit, but instead of healthy trees, they found bare, dead trunks, and the chain reaction was clear. Adults couldn't feed themselves, and chicks had even less chance. The bird population began to plummet. To be honest, this bird never really had a chance to become numerous. Wilkins bunting lives in a tiny area and depends on specific trees, which means food is limited by definition. The population was always small simply because the island is small and the forest isn't endless, but before people and before scale insects, the birds were doing relatively okay. Even with low numbers, the population stayed in balance. In 2018, scientists counted about 119 breeding pairs, not thousands, not hundreds of thousands, just a little over 100 pairs in the entire world. Then came 2021 and a second count. After the storms, with forests dying off in the background, the species status was immediately upgraded. Or downgraded? Either way, it was changed from endangered to critically endangered. Observations showed only about 20 pairs had survived. That's a drop of more than 80%. And if that number feels abstract, let's translate it into a scale your brain can actually grasp. The US has roughly 335 million people, and minus 80% would be like 268 million people vanishing in an instant, Thanos style. You'd be left with basically just California and Texas, and even then not their full populations. And imagine if that happened. Everyone would be like screaming about it. The media, charities, politicians. But Wilkins bunting's just some small bird hardly anyone's heard of. So its disappearance was noticed by only a handful of people, those who genuinely care about this island and its forest. And for them, it was a real blow. The population was already hanging by a thread, and then it suddenly plunged to the brink. That raised a terrifying question. Would they even make it in time to save the bird from total extinction? That's why several organizations and institutions joined forces with the Tristan da Cunha government and began developing a rescue plan for the buntings. Sure, it's not the same as saving America, but it deserves respect. Scale insects are spreading, the forest is dying, and the island's birds are hanging by a thread. So what do you do when you're on a speck of land in the middle of the ocean and you don't have a quick-fix nature repair kit? Scientists went with the most dependable route, classic biological control. That means you don't carpet bomb everything with chemicals, you bring in an organism that hits the target species only. And this isn't experimental wizardry. The method has a long track record specifically against scale insects. For example, on St. Helena, it was used to save native eucalyptus trees. But that immediately raises the next question. Which species do you release? The let's bring in lots of predators approach doesn't work here. An island's a fragile system, and one mistake could be disastrous. So researchers evaluated a wide range of parasitoids that can attack soft scales and ultimately chose the wasp, Microteres neatneri. Its biggest advantage is safety. In biological control, you can't release just anything. You need a specialized hunter that won't switch to other insects along the way. This wasp targets scale insects, including several species, and is already present in southern Africa. So the wasp isn't just a predator, it's also legally convenient. Why does this matter? Because the only way to reach Tristan da Cunha is via Cape Town. And the researchers needed a species that couldn't accidentally cause trouble in South Africa if something went sideways. If you watch our videos, you already know how quickly that can happen. So how does this wasp actually work? As soon as it's released, it starts hunting for soft scale insects to lay its eggs in. And for the scale, that's a death sentence. 2 to 3 weeks later, one or more dark rings appear on the infected scale insect. It's a clear visual marker. The scale's dead, and the next shift of parasitic wasps is already on the way. New wasps hatch from the eggs, search for the next host, and the cycle repeats. But before releasing anything into the wild, the scientists had to make sure the whole system worked exactly as intended. The project began in July 2020, and the first year was spent on quarantine trials. They grew host plant cultures, bred the scale insect Coccus hesperidum, and reared the control agent in a secure environment. Then they tested how effective it was under climate conditions as close as possible to Tristan da Cunha, so it wouldn't turn out the wasp only works in a nice warm room. That's me. I only work in a nice warm room. And here's the almost ironic part. No one had ever tried anything like this before, simply because in the normal world, natural predators keep this scale insect in check. Only on this island were there no predators. And for the first time, the scale got truly perfect conditions. After that came the waiting, like the countdown before a rocket launch. 6 months of rearing, monitoring, tests, quarantine, and paperwork, and finally the larva matured. And at that moment, the scientists realized that was it. Now it was their turn to play the role they'd been brought into this story for in the first place. Here I need to make a small correction. It sounds great like they brought the wasps over and immediately released them on Nightingale, but in reality that didn't happen, because the journey was too brutal. So many wasps died in transit that there simply weren't enough left for a proper release. That's when the scientists faced a new task: rebuild the population first. The wasps that did survive were bred on Tristan da Cunha, the closest place to Nightingale where people actually live and where you can do real field work. So first you had to rescue the rescuers. Makes sense. The insects lived in boxes like these. This is where they were bred, tested, and monitored to make sure everything stayed on track. At first, only under safe, controlled conditions. No surprises, no unintended side effects. And then they ran into a surprisingly practical problem. What do you even raise wasps on? They need a host plant, a place to live and reproduce actively. In the end, they successfully switched them to Malabar spinach, and the wasps took to it. If that hadn't worked, the whole operation would have failed. But the wasps multiplied, established themselves, and wait, what if there are too many of them? Biological control sounds like the perfect alternative to pesticides. Instead of spraying chemicals, you release the right insect and it takes care of the pest for you. Against invasive species, it can be a genuinely effective tool, but sometimes the would-be savior turns into a problem itself. A great example is the harlequin ladybird. Originally, it was a helpful biocontrol agent from Asia, and people began introducing it around the world as far back as the 1910s to wipe out aphids and scale insects. The trouble is, the harlequin turned out to be too good at surviving. It spread far beyond its native range, and that range is enormous, stretching from Kazakhstan in the west all the way to the Pacific coast in the east. In the end, the harlequin ladybird established itself in at least 59 countries where it was never supposed to exist. Now it's considered a threat to native ladybird species because it doesn't stick to one job. It hunts the larvae of other species, and sometimes it even switches over to fruit. And the surprises don't stop there. The harlequin is also seen as a household nuisance because in winter it crawls into homes and buildings and forms huge overwintering swarms. And if you get a little too close, it can bite. They promised a tiny garden helper and delivered a roommate that keeps trying to nip you in the ass. Which brings up the question any normal person would ask, could the same thing happen with the wasp scientists brought to Nightingale? Let's start with the basics. Like, what is a wasp anyway? Most people picture big yellow striped things that hurt like hell and ruin picnics, but the wasps introduced to Nightingale are from a completely different universe. They don't even look like the usual kind. Here's a wasp sitting on a fingertip, a female about 0.08 inches long. That's genuinely tiny, basically a speck you'd only notice if you were really looking. For comparison, the normal wasps most people run into are usually about 0.4 to 0.6 inches long. That's several times bigger. So the obvious question is, are they dangerous? No. Parasitoid wasps harm only pests. They don't even need to defend a nest because they don't have one. Their whole life cycle is just finding the right pest host, and that's it. Nothing personal and nothing unnecessary. Even more important, these wasps are usually highly specialized. One species targets one specific pest, and other insects simply don't interest it. That's basically a built-in safety feature. If the right host disappears, the wasps disappear from that area too. Human impact is essentially a non-issue. Nightingale Island has no permanent residents. Only tourists and scientists show up, and not all the time. And the release happened deep inside the island, right in the damaged forest, so the wasps couldn't affect anything except the scale insects. Bottom line, there's zero risk and zero hassle for humans. And the answer to the big question, could the wasp get out of control, is most likely no. it has nothing else to switch to, nowhere meaningful to spread, and the location is far too remote to reach anywhere else. Still, the scientists didn't stop at releasing wasps to save the forest and birds, because even with biocontrol, the forest won't regrow overnight. A wasp can stop a pest, but it can't conjure new trees out of thin air, so they needed a second front too. Scientists have set up a tree nursery to boost the number of trees while also tightening the island's biosecurity, basically to stop any new non-native species from hitching a ride in with people and cargo. In short, strict inspections and controls from now on. Right now, the main focus is restoring the Filica arborea woodland and the bird's habitat. They propagate the trees, raise seedlings, and transplant them, but it doesn't end there. The tree grows slowly, so this is a very long-term investment. The program started back in 2016 when researchers transplanted 220 tiny seedlings under about 4 inches tall, plus another 80 larger ones. They moved them from an infested forest into a parasite-free area. Still waiting. Slow growth is one thing, but when do these trees actually start feeding the birds? Birds don't need pretty plantings, they need fruit. And Filica arborea has a clear threshold. Seedlings begin fruiting once the trunk base is over about 0.8 inches in diameter. On average, that's around 5 years after planting. I also checked the latest updates. The most recent major planting took place in April 2023. Back then, scientists planted 157 healthy young trees in areas where older ones had been wiped out by a storm. That's the long-term good news. If everything goes well, those trees should start fruiting in 2 to 3 years. That means more food for the birds, and finally a real chance for the population to grow a bit. And it already is growing if you look at the bigger picture. That's how the island's vegetation has changed over the past few decades, right in the very forest where the birds live. And this is one of those cases where an image really does speak louder than words. And yes, all of this was done by tiny wasps. Scientists believe they're the reason the bird avoided extinction at its most vulnerable moment. In February 2024, surveys showed that Nightingale Island still had roughly 60 to 90 breeding pairs of Wilkins buntings. Sure, the population took a serious hit, no one's pretending otherwise. But there's another twist you don't often get in stories like this. After the wasps were released, the forest bounced back surprisingly fast. Researchers expect the bunting numbers to level off and then start rising. And if you want a human reaction instead of statistics, I've got that too. David Kinchin-Smith, the RSPB's UK Overseas Territories Project Manager, says this project shows what's possible when people genuinely commit to changing an endangered species' fate. In his view, the success came down to 3 things: iron resolve, ecological know-how, and a hefty dose of luck. But what's most striking are the details scientists only noticed once they were on the ground. Surveys in 2024 found that some large trees survived and are still producing fruit, even if a storm once knocked them over. When you thought you'd finally get the rest after dying, but work still drags you in. So now the goal isn't just save whoever's left, it's to push the whole island back toward normal. Little by little, the forest is starting to function again as a food source. And for the birds, that means a real shot at coming back. And it's a pretty decent shot because Wilkins buntings, honestly, are used to toughing it out. These little birds have made it through similar disasters before. Satellite images from 2005 revealed something interesting. A comparable loss of forest cover had already happened after a major storm in 2001. So the 2019 story, however terrifying it looked, wasn't unique for the island. Take a look at these photos. In 2005, the forest was still sparse, clearly injured, badly battered by the wind, but by 2016 it looked like a normal forest again, dense and alive. And if the buntings got through that upheaval without dying out, they can pull off the same trick again. This is roughly what the island and its forest look like today. To me, it looks like a comeback. Of course, there's an important caveat. Back in the early 2000s, the trees weren't infested with scale insects, but things are different now. After the wasps were released, we can at least tentatively assume that the problem is being dealt with because the scale insects are genuinely being pushed back. So overall, the situation no longer feels as bleak as it did a couple of years ago. The scale is being eradicated, the forest is recovering, and the bird is, in a sense, built for storms by life on the island itself. If it couldn't survive in those conditions, it would have vanished long ago. But the bunting has held on all this time, which means it'll keep holding on. And you owe me a like. See you later.